The station hung in the void like an unwanted guest at a party, a clunky assemblage of metal and bad decisions orbiting the gas giant's swirling storms. Inside, the air was tinged with the faint aroma of despair and overcooked protein rations. Station Commander Bracken stared at the flickering console, his face etched with the kind of weariness that came from trying to manage a crew of experts in incompetence. "You know," he grumbled to no one in particular, "if it wasn't for the fact that we're all due for a fiery death in Jupiter's embrace, I'd almost consider retirement." Hylas Venter, the bureaucrat sent to make Bracken's life even more miserable, sauntered in with the kind of confidence that suggested he'd never tried anything harder than filing a report. "Commander," he began, voice oozing like molasses, "I'm here to ensure that our mission remains on schedule." Bracken rolled his eyes, a gesture he had perfected to communicate disdain without words. "Oh joy, another pencil pusher to tell me how to do my job, just what I needed." Venter plopped into the nearest chair, his immaculate suit somehow untouched by the station's pervasive grime. "Actually, Commander, I'm here because there are anomalies in the atmosphere." "Anomalies, you say?" Bracken's eyebrows rose. "What could possibly go wrong with a giant ball of deadly gases?" "It's not just the usual death gases," Venter replied, his voice as smooth as ever. "Our sensors picked up signs of unauthorized terraforming activity." Bracken leaned back, folding his arms with a smirk. "Oh, perfect. Just when I thought things couldn't get worse. Some idiots decided to play God on Jupiter." The station's alarms blared, like an obnoxious reminder that everything was terrible. Lights flickered, and the console spat out data like a malfunctioning slot machine. "That's the anomaly," Venter said, pointing at the screen with the enthusiasm of someone pointing out a particularly interesting piece of lint. "Yeah, I see it," Bracken replied, trying to suppress the urge to throttle the man. "So what are we supposed to do about it?" Venter shrugged, the universal gesture of bureaucratic indifference. "Figure it out, I suppose. That's what you're here for, isn't it?" Bracken let out a long, suffering sigh. "Right. Because when the universe throws a wrench in the works, it's always my job to fix it." The commander turned to the screen, squinting at the jumble of numbers and graphs that represented their impending doom. "Looks like someone's been busy down there." "Busy is one word for it," Venter agreed, folding his hands over his stomach like a contented cat. "Another would be insane," Bracken snorted. "Insane or just damn unlucky. There's always some lunatic with a god complex trying to meddle with things they shouldn't. Or maybe they're just tired of Earth and wanted a change of scenery," Venter suggested, as though he were discussing vacation plans rather than planetary catastrophe. "Yeah, because a place with storms bigger than Earth is prime real estate," Bracken shot back, shaking his head. "You pencil pushers and your optimism," Venter gave him a cold smile. "Optimism is just delusion with better PR, Commander, but we still need to stop this before it becomes a problem." "You mean before it becomes a problem?" Bracken laughed, the kind of laughter that carried the weight of impending doom. "It's already a problem, Venter. We're just deciding how big it's going to get." "So what's the plan?" Venter asked, more interested in the answer than the question. Bracken rubbed his temples, feeling the headache of responsibility settling in like an unwanted roommate. "We need to figure out who's behind this and why." Venter nodded, clearly satisfied with passing the buck of responsibility. "Exactly. And that's where you come in." "Great," Bracken muttered, turning back to the console. "Just what I always wanted, to be the hero of a disaster movie." Venter stood up, brushing imaginary dust from his suit. "I'll be in my office if you need me. Try not to let the station explode in the meantime." "I'll do my best," Bracken replied with a mock salute, watching as Venter disappeared down the corridor. The commander turned back to the console, staring at the data with the resignation of a man who knew he was in over his head. "Looks like we're in for a hell of a ride," he muttered, his voice barely audible over the distant rumble of the station's machinery. In a corner of the control room, a screen flickered to life, displaying the swirling chaos of Jupiter's atmosphere. Bracken watched, feeling a strange sense of awe at the sheer destructive beauty of it all. Of all the places to die, he said to himself, at least it'll be memorable. He reached for the comms, dialing in the frequency that connected him to the rest of his motley crew. "This is Commander Bracken. We've got a situation," he announced, his voice echoing through the station's corridors. "Define situation," crackled a voice in response, dripping with sarcasm. "The kind where we might crash and burn if we don't figure out who's messing with Jupiter," Bracken replied. "Oh, so just another Tuesday then," the voice retorted. Despite himself, Bracken chuckled. "Yeah, just another Tuesday in the most miserable part of the universe." Another voice chimed in, this one less amused and more resigned. "What's the plan, boss?" "First, we figure out who's behind it," Bracken said, glancing at the console as if it might magically provide answers. "Then we stop them before they turn us into a cautionary tale." "Sounds like a party," came the reply, the sarcasm not quite hiding the underlying concern. "Yeah, a real party," Bracken agreed, wondering if they'd have enough time to regret all their life choices before the end. "Let's just hope it doesn't turn into a funeral." As the comms fell silent, Bracken sat back, staring at the swirling chaos on the screen. "At least it'll be memorable," he repeated to himself, a small, grim smile tugging at his lips. But deep down, he knew that memorable was just another word for terrifying. And if history had taught him anything, it was that terrifying had a way of turning into disastrous all too quickly. The station continued its orbit, a fragile speck above the stormy giant below. Somewhere out there, someone was playing with powers they didn't understand. And it was up to Bracken and his team to stop them before everything went up in flames. As Bracken stared into the swirling abyss, he couldn't help but feel a strange kinship with those storms. Both of them were just waiting for the right trigger to unleash hell. "Here's to hoping we can keep the lid on this mess," he murmured, the words lost to the hum of the station's life support systems. In the void of space, hope was as rare as a competent bureaucrat. But sometimes it was all you had, and Bracken, for better or worse, was holding onto it like a lifeline. Bracken was just about to enjoy the lukewarm remains of his protein sludge when the console emitted a sound resembling a flatulent asteroid. He glared at it. What now? The universe got another joke at my expense. He tapped a few keys, the screen sputtering with relentless data. Lines of code danced like drunken spiders, revealing a pattern that made his stomach lurch. "Oh, you've got to be kidding me." The door hissed open and in sauntered Hyla's Venter, pristine as ever, like a man who thought space grime was beneath him. Bracken envied that kind of obliviousness. "What's got you looking like you just swallowed a space rat, Commander? Turns out our little terraforming problem might not be some deranged human after all." Bracken motioned at the screen. Venter leaned closer, finally showing a hint of interest. "Aliens, you say? How original." "I was hoping for something more pedestrian, like a rogue AI or a rebellious toaster." "Yeah, aliens," Bracken confirmed, trying to ignore the thrill of vindication. "Sensors picked up traces of tech that doesn't match anything we've seen. Must be from outside the neighborhood." Venter raised an eyebrow, the closest thing to an emotional reaction Bracken had seen from him. "So not just trespassers but intergalactic squatters." "Seems like it," Bracken said, pondering the sheer absurdity of it all. "And here I thought my biggest problem was getting decent coffee." The console let out another warning buzz, this time even more insistent, like a cat demanding attention by shredding your furniture. Venter, with his bureaucratic flair, gestured dismissively. "More bad news, I presume?" Bracken groaned at the screen. "Electrical storms are getting worse. If a bolt hits us, we'll be toast, literally." Venter leaned back, hands behind his head, clearly enjoying the chaos from his detached perch. "A shocking development, Commander. What's the plan?" Bracken rubbed his temples. "Well, standard procedure would involve a strategic retreat, but you've seen our engines. They are about as reliable as a politician's promise. So, we're stuck in a cosmic hellhole with aliens messing around," Venter summarized, a hint of amusement in his voice. And a bureaucratic system that moves slower than molasses in zero-G, Bracken added. Speaking of, how about you pull some strings to get us support? You think there's a protocol for alien squatters on Jupiter, Venter chuckled. I can send a memo, might get a response before we all turn to space dust. Bracken's comms crackled to life with the voice of Engineer Puck, whose tone was as optimistic as a funeral director's. Commander, the reactor's acting up, again, Bracken sighed. Of course it is, why wouldn't it be? Venter's grin was infuriatingly confident. Well, I'm sure you'll manage, Commander. After all, you're the one with experience handling this merry band of misfits. Bracken shot him a glare that could melt hull plating. If by experience you mean desperation, then sure. The console sent another alert, this one flashing with an urgent crimson. Venter's amusement faded as he squinted at the display. What's that mean? It means, Bracken said, his voice dripping with sarcasm, that we've got another visitor. And this one isn't bringing cookies. Fantastic, Venter muttered, his calm demeanor cracking ever so slightly. I suppose it's too much to hope they're just here for a friendly chat. Yeah, friendly isn't really in their vocabulary, Bracken replied, studying the data. Looks like an automated probe scanning us. Venter straightened his suit, as if preparing for a diplomatic meeting rather than potential annihilation. I suggest we respond in kind. Bracken raised an eyebrow. You want to chat up an alien probe? Not chat exactly, Venter clarified, but it wouldn't hurt to let them know we're here. Maybe they'll think twice before turning us into space debris. Or they'll see it as an invitation to throw a welcome party, Bracken muttered, debating whether to follow through or just sit back and enjoy the impending disaster. In the end, he opted for the former, tapping into the station's meager communication array. This is Station Commander Bracken. Identify yourselves or bugger off. Venter winced. Very diplomatic, Commander, Bracken shrugged. I'm not exactly in the mood for pleasantries. The probe seemed to pause as though considering its options before launching a series of signals back. The station's translation algorithms worked overtime, spitting out a message that scrolled across the console like a passive-aggressive text from an X. Greetings, Earthling. Cease interference or face consequences. Bracken laughed, a sound devoid of humor. Oh, that's rich. We're the ones interfering. Venter studied the message, his expression unreadable. Well, at least they said greetings. That's something. Yeah, lovely to know our impending doom comes with manners, Bracken quipped, eyeing the probe's data streams as they continued to weave through Jupiter's atmosphere like a demented spider web. Venter clapped his hands together, the sound echoing in the tense air. Looks like we might need to take a more active approach. Active as in let's blow something up, Bracken asked, half joking, half serious. Preferably not ourselves, Venter replied. But we can't just ignore this. I doubt our bureaucratic overlords have a contingency plan for pissed-off aliens. Bracken chuckled darkly. No, I suppose they don't. But let's face it, when have they ever had a plan that made sense? Venter nodded, acknowledging the truth they'd both been skirting around. So what's our next move, Commander? Bracken tapped the console, pulling up the station's meager offensive capabilities. We could try jamming their signals, make it harder for them to coordinate. And if they find out what we're doing? Venter asked. Bracken grinned, a wolfish gleam in his eye. Then we hope they've got a sense of humor. Venter sighed, adjusting his tie as though preparing for a presentation rather than a potential interstellar incident. I suppose it's better than just waiting for them to crush us. That's the spirit, Bracken said, already programming the station's systems to interfere with the probe's communications. Always good to go down swinging. As Bracken finalized the commands, the station's systems whirred to life, the hum of machinery filling the air with a newfound urgency. If the aliens wanted a fight, they were about to get one, or at least an annoyance worthy of a mosquito at a backyard barbecue. Bracken leaned back, eyeing Venter with a kind of grudging respect. Got any more pearls of bureaucratic wisdom to share? Venter smirked, leaning against the console with the ease of a man born to navigate red tape. Just this, if you're going to piss off aliens, do it with style. The The comms crackled again, this time with the voice of Puck, whose tone suggested they were one power surge away from a complete meltdown. "Commander, whatever you're doing, make it quick." "The reactor's not going to last much longer." Bracken rolled his eyes. "Of course it isn't. Why would anything work when you need it?" He turned to Venter, who seemed oddly calm despite everything. "Well, that's the cherry on the disaster sundae. Any other bright ideas?" Venter shrugged, the picture of bureaucratic indifference. "Maybe try not to die." "I hear it's bad for your health." "Thanks for the tip," Bracken muttered, eyeing the console as the station's systems continued their attempts to disrupt the alien probe. "Let's see if these aliens know how to take a hint." The probe's response was immediate, the message flashing up on the screen with the urgency of a ransom note. "Cease interference or face annihilation." "Well, that's a bit dramatic," Venter commented, unfazed. "At least we got their attention," Bracken snorted. "Yeah, but I'd rather not have it. Kinda like that creepy ex who won't stop texting." Venter chuckled, an unexpected sound in the midst of impending doom. "Guess we've got our work cut out for us." Bracken nodded, the weight of responsibility settling over him once more. "Let's just hope we can keep this station in one piece long enough to figure out what they really want." Venter gave a non-committal shrug, as though the potential destruction of their outpost was merely a minor inconvenience. "Whatever happens, at least it'll be memorable." "That's what I'm afraid of," Bracken murmured, watching the screens with a mixture of dread and determination. The probe continued its surveillance, oblivious, or perhaps indifferent to the human antics above. Bracken could only hope their attempts at interference would buy them enough time to understand the alien agenda and maybe, just maybe, avoid a spectacularly fiery demise. As the station drifted through the void, orbiting its tempestuous host, Bracken knew one thing for certain. The universe had a sick sense of humor. "Here's hoping we survive to laugh about it," he said, mostly to himself, the words almost lost to the mechanical symphony around him. Venter, ever the optimist, clapped him on the shoulder. "Until then, Commander." Bracken watched the swirling chaos of Jupiter below, aware of the monumental task ahead. Facing down an alien threat with nothing but a dysfunctional station and a team of misfits seemed about as promising as a snowball in hell. But then again, Bracken mused, if life in space had taught him anything, it was that underprepared and outgunned was par for the course. And who knew? Maybe, just maybe, they might pull off a miracle, or at the very least go down with a bang. Bracken stared at the console like it was an ancient relic, one that might suddenly spout wisdom or just burst into flames. With the way his day was going, he bet on the latter. "Bloody hell, Venter," he muttered, running a hand through his hair, which was now defying gravity in the worst way. "I swear if Earth doesn't pick up, I'm going to throw this console out the nearest airlock." Venter, the picture of unruffled composure, adjusted his suit with the care of a man who knew he was about to be incinerated but wanted to look good when it happened. "I'm sure the bureaucratic gods are hard at work, crafting the perfect response. Probably just waiting for the right font." Bracken snorted. "Yeah, because everyone knows alien invasions require Times New Roman." The comms link hummed with vague indifference, a sound that was both familiar and infuriating. Bracken punched the button again, sending yet another message into the void. "Earth Command, do you read? This is Station Commander Bracken. We're facing an alien threat. Repeat, alien threat. Any assistance would be appreciated before we become cosmic dust." Silence. Not even the crackle of static to keep him company. It was like shouting into a black hole. The red tape back home was thicker than Jupiter's atmosphere and about as impenetrable. Venter scratched his chin. "Think they are ignoring us?" Bracken scoffed. "If by ignoring you mean stuck in a committee meeting to discuss the color of the emergency response binder, then yes. Maybe we should have sent a fruit basket," Venter suggested, dry as a Martian desert. "Or a singing telegram," Bracken added, his voice dripping with sarcasm. Something catchy like "Help us, we're screwed," set to a jingle. A loud clattering echoed from the corridor, followed by the appearance of Hylas Ventur, who seemed to glide into the room with the grace of a man utterly unfazed by imminent catastrophe. "Commander Ventur," Hylas greeted, his voice as smooth as ever, as if they were discussing the weather rather than trying to prevent an apocalypse. "I found something interesting." Bracken raised an eyebrow, intrigued despite himself. "Unless it's a recipe for better coffee, I'm not sure I want to know." Hylas produced a datapad, its screen glowing with ominous data streams. "Documents," he said, "relating to our friends in orbit. Seems they've got big plans for Jupiter." "Plans?" Bracken echoed, peering at the screen. "What, like installing a new set of rings, terraforming?" Hylas clarified, his tone annoyingly calm. "And not the friendly, let's make it a holiday destination kind." Bracken absorbed this, his brain doing the mental gymnastics of tying it all together. "So, they're not just squatting. They're redecorating." Ventur crossed his arms, leaning against the console as if it were a bar top. "And I'm guessing they didn't ask for permission." "Looks like it," Hylas confirmed, "and judging by the documents, they're not too concerned about us getting in the way." Bracken let out a low whistle. "Well, that's just great. Aliens with a god complex. Can this day get any better?" "Only if the reactor blows," Ventur deadpanned. "Thanks for that image," Bracken replied, shaking his head. "So, what's the plan?" "We can't exactly roll out the welcome mat for a terraforming party. We need to stall them," Hylas suggested, his voice as smooth as ever, despite the storm gathering in his eyes. "Delay their plans until Earth decides to wake up and do something useful." "Stall them?" Ventur echoed, raising an eyebrow. "And how do you propose we do that?" "Send them a strongly worded letter." Bracken stroked his chin, his mind racing through possibilities like a rat in a maze. "We could try messing with their equipment. Sabotage their efforts, make them think twice about sticking around." Ventur grinned, a wolfish gleam in his eye. "A bit of sabotage, you say? Now that's something I can get behind." "Hold your horses, cowboy," Bracken cautioned. "We're talking precision here. One wrong move and we might be inviting them to retaliate in a way we won't enjoy." "Precision is my middle name," Ventur quipped, though his eyes suggested otherwise. "Your middle name is actually Trouble," Bracken retorted, though he found himself warming to the idea. Maybe they could buy themselves some breathing room, and maybe even a few laughs at the aliens' expense. Hylas, ever the voice of reason, nodded. "We'll need to coordinate carefully. Whatever we do, it has to look like a technical glitch." Bracken grinned at the thought. "A glitch, huh? I'm sure Puck can arrange for that. He's practically a walking glitch himself." "Speaking of Puck," Hylas added, his expression a touch more serious, "he mentioned the reactor's on its last legs. We'll need to handle that if we want to keep the lights on." Bracken sighed, the weight of the station's many issues pressing down on him once more. "Of course it is. Why wouldn't it be? We're stuck between a rock and a hard place." Ventur sighed, his usual cynicism tinged with a hint of resignation. "And that rock is about to detonate." "Story of my life," Bracken muttered, tapping commands into the console. "Let's just hope this works, or we'll be the shortest-lived nuisance in alien history." With a plan, if one could call it that, forming in their minds, Bracken felt a flicker of something he hadn't in a long while. It was like hope, but uglier and with far fewer chances of survival. "Right," he said, his voice steely with resolve. "Let's go annoy some aliens." *****. The reactor room was a symphony of chaos. Wires dangled like vines in an overgrown jungle, sparks flying in a deadly dance that threatened to turn the whole place into a barbecue pit. Puck was in the middle of it all, tinkering with a panel that screamed for mercy. "Puck," Bracken barked over the din, "how's it looking?" Puck didn't even glance up. "Like a cat with one life left, Commander. Any sudden movements, and it's curtains for all of us." "Perfect," Bracken replied, with all the enthusiasm of a man facing a firing squad. "I need you to make it look like the aliens are having technical difficulties." "Think you can manage?" Puck grinned, a sight that was more unsettling than reassuring. "Make it look like the aliens are as technologically illiterate as our crew." "Piece of cake," Good, Bracken said, casting a wary eye around at the flickering lights. Just make sure you don't blow us up in the process. I promise nothing, Puck replied with a mischievous glint. But I'll do my best not to fry us all. Bracken nodded, feeling marginally better. Let's get to it then. The sooner we get them off our backs, the sooner we can focus on not dying in a fiery explosion. With Puck elbow-deep in cables and circuits, Bracken turned his attention back to the console. The messages to Earth might as well have been sent via carrier pigeon, for all the good they were doing. Any luck with Earth Command? Venter asked, appearing beside him with a cup of something that might have once been coffee. Judging by the smell, it was now a war crime. None, Bracken said, wrinkling his nose at the cup. I'm starting to think they've forgotten we exist. Or maybe they're hoping we'll solve this on our own and spare them the paperwork. Venter chuckled, taking a sip and grimacing as though he'd swallowed battery acid. Wouldn't surprise me. Bureaucracy at its finest. Hylas rejoined them, datapad still in hand. The documents suggest they are on a tight schedule. If we can disrupt their operations, we might force them to reconsider their timeline. Or drive them to speed it up, Bracken countered, unsure whether to be hopeful or dread the outcome. There's always that risk. It's a gamble, Hylas admitted, his voice as steady as the station was not. But one we may have to take if we want any chance of survival. Bracken nodded, aware of the truth in Hylas's words. They were outmanned, outgunned, and out of options. But they weren't out of spirit, not yet. Right, he said, determination setting his jaw tight. Let's make some noise. The probe outside remained oblivious to the human antics aboard the station, its signals weaving through Jupiter's atmosphere like threads in a cosmic tapestry. But as Puck's handiwork started to take effect, it became clear that things were not going as smoothly as planned. Commander, Puck's voice crackled over the comms, thick with urgency. I think we've got their attention. Bracken glanced at the console, where the alien probe's data streams appeared to be faltering. Good work, Puck. Let's hope they see it as a sign of incompetence and not an act of war. Venter, who was watching with a look of amused curiosity, chimed in. I must say, Commander, you've got a flair for creating chaos. It's a gift, Bracken replied, though his eyes were fixed on the screens, searching for any sign of retaliation. The minutes ticked by, each one stretching longer than the last. But eventually the probe's signals began to settle, its attention diverted by the fabricated malfunctions. They're buying it, Hylas said, his tone carrying a note of relief. For now, at least. Bracken allowed himself a brief smile, though the tension in his shoulders refused to ease. Let's not get too comfortable. We've still got a long way to go. The probe continued its dance around Jupiter, its purpose as inscrutable as ever. But for now, it seemed they'd bought themselves a little more time, a precious commodity in the vastness of space. As Bracken surveyed the station's battered systems, he felt the weight of the coming days pressing down on him. They were far from safe, but at least they weren't dead yet. And in the grim, unforgiving vacuum of space, that was as good a victory as any. Here's to living another day, Bracken muttered, raising an imaginary glass to the indifferent stars. Venter clinked his own invisible drink against Bracken's. To living, he agreed, the ghost of a smile playing at his lips. Hylas, ever the pragmatist, merely nodded. And to whatever comes next, as the station drifted on, a fragile speck against the vastness of Jupiter's storms, Bracken couldn't shake the feeling that their story was far from over. But for now, survival was enough. After all, in a universe that seemed intent on wiping them out, living to fight another day was a victory in itself. The station felt like a tin can caught in a hurricane. Bracken clung to the nearest rail as the whole structure shuddered, lights flickering in a desperate disco of electricity. He could hear the creaks and groans of metal stressing against forces it was never designed to withstand. It was like standing inside an angry vending machine, and he was the only one without a refund button. Hey, Venter, Bracken hollered over the cacophony, you ever feel like a sardine in a blender? Venter, ever the model of elegance even when being jostled like a rag doll, quirked an eyebrow. Can't say I have, Commander. But if this gets any worse, we might just end up as soup. Not the worst way I've imagined going, Bracken replied, but nowhere near the top of the list. Around them, the station's systems were having a nervous breakdown. Panels spat sparks, displays blinked erratically, and somewhere down the corridor, an alarm was blaring with all the insistence of a nagging mother-in-law. It was enough to make anyone want to crawl into the nearest escape pod and ride the storm out in blissful unconsciousness. "How's Puck doing with our little technical spectacle?" Bracken asked, fighting to keep his balance as the station rocked again. Hylas, holding onto a bolted-down terminal like it was the last lifeboat off the Titanic, checked his datapad. Still alive, surprisingly. But he says the reactor's throwing a tantrum, some sort of feedback loop from the terraforming activity. It doesn't appreciate the competition. Bracken grunted. Just what we need, an existential crisis from a glorified battery. At least it's got feelings, Venter quipped. More than I can say for the aliens. Speaking of those galactic interior decorators, Bracken said, we need a plan. Something more than just tripping over our own feet. "And what do you propose, O fearless leader?" Venter asked, sarcasm dripping from every syllable. Bracken took a deep breath, steadying himself against the rolling tremors. "We need to hit them where it hurts, whatever's at the core of their operation. We've got to disrupt their terraforming equipment directly." Bold, Hylas mused, and spectacularly risky. "You sure about this?" "Not in the slightest," Bracken admitted. "But when you've got nothing left to lose, you might as well bet the house." The station lurched violently, sending a cart of unspeakably questionable rations skidding across the floor. It crashed into the wall with a satisfying thud, scattering packets like confetti at a very unpopular parade. "Feels like the house is already crumbling," Venter observed dryly. Bracken was about to respond when the console beeped insistently, as if demanding attention like a toddler left unchecked. He glanced at the display, which was now spewing a stream of bureaucratic jargon that made his eyes glaze over. "Great," Bracken said through gritted teeth. "Earth Command wants a detailed assessment before we take any action." Because, of course, the paperwork is more important than the giant alien machines reshaping a planet. "Ah, bureaucracy," Venter sighed, "the true universal constant." Hylas was scanning the document. "They want us to assess the risk, projected outcomes, and potential collateral damage. Basically, write them a novel while Rome burns." "Time we don't have," Bracken muttered, frustration bubbling beneath the surface. "We can't wait for Earth to give us the go-ahead. If we don't act now, we're toast." "Or whatever the space equivalent of toast is," Venter added helpfully. Bracken slammed his fist on the console, the impact leaving a dent that matched the one in his patience. "We need to do something, and we need to do it fast." "Well, Commander," Venter said, flashing a grin that was all teeth and no warmth, "if we're going to go down, let's at least make it interesting." The station jolted again, and Bracken had to admire the irony. It felt like the universe was shaking its fist at him, daring him to make the next move. "All right," Bracken said, decision made. "We'll take a shuttle and head for the source of their terraforming operations. Knock it offline, or at least give them a reason to reconsider their cosmic landscaping project. And who gets the honor of joining you on this suicidal venture?" Venter inquired, his tone suggesting that he already knew the answer. "You and Hylas," Bracken replied, his voice firm. "You're both the best we've got, and I need you to keep me from doing something stupid." Hylas nodded, his expression unreadable but resolved. "I'll prep the shuttle." "Better pack a lunch," Venter said, "just in case we don't get a chance to come back for seconds." As Hylas moved to ready the shuttle, Bracken allowed himself a moment to breathe. It wasn't much of a plan, more like a half-baked recipe for disaster, but it was all they had, and right now that was enough. "Commander," Venter said, his voice uncharacteristically serious, "if this doesn't work—" "Let's not think about that," Bracken interrupted, forcing a smile. "If it doesn't work, we'll be too dead to care. With that, they set off toward the shuttle bay, the station's wails echoing like a ghostly chorus of everything that could possibly go wrong. Asterisk, 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 the shuttle was a battered beast, more rust than ship, but it had one thing going for it: it still worked. Barely. Bracken took the helm, flicking switches and pressing buttons with the confidence of someone who didn't know what half of them did. Hylas and Venter strapped in beside him, neither looking particularly thrilled but both resolute. "All set?" Bracken asked, glancing at his companions. "As ready as I'll ever be to dive into the jaws of the unknown," Venter replied, his tone as dry as the Martian desert. Hylas simply nodded, his focus on the control panel. "Let's make it quick. The longer we take, the less likely we'll succeed. Or survive," Bracken added, because at this point, why sugarcoat anything? The shuttle's engines roared to life, shaking them in their seats as if the very machinery was trying to dislodge them. With a shuddering leap, they left the security, or what little there was, of the station behind. "Heading for the coordinates we picked up earlier," Hylas reported, his hands dancing over the controls with practiced ease. "If they are operating from anywhere, it'll be there." Bracken gripped the controls, steering the shuttle through the storm of Jupiter's atmosphere with the finesse of someone playing a particularly violent video game. Lightning crackled outside, fingers of electricity reaching out like the hands of a furious god. "Remind me again why we decided to play hero," Bracken muttered, squinting at the swirling chaos ahead. "Because the alternative was sitting on our hands and waiting to die," Venter deadpanned. "And I don't know about you, but I'm not a fan of passive extinction." "Fair point," Bracken conceded, muscles tense as he navigated through the storm. The coordinates were getting closer, the alien structures becoming visible even through the thick, roiling clouds. They were massive, intricate assemblies of unfamiliar technology, pulsing with light and energy in a way that made human constructions look like kindergarten art projects. "All right, here's the plan," Bracken said, voice tight with concentration. "We get in, hit their control systems, and get out. Fast and clean. And if it all goes to hell," Venter asked, arching an eyebrow. "Then we improvise," Bracken replied, trying not to think too hard about what that might entail. The shuttle approached the alien installation, sensors pinging with warnings that Bracken chose to ignore. This was no time for second-guessing. Either they'd succeed or they'd go out in a blaze of glory. "Looks like they've got some kind of shield up," Hylas noted, studying the readings with a frown. "Figures," Bracken muttered. "Nothing's ever easy, is it?" "Nope," Venter said, "but nobody said it would be." "What's the plan, Chief?" Bracken thought quickly, assessing their options. "We punch through, hit them hard and fast, and hope they don't see it coming." "Sounds like a plan," Venter said, a reckless grin on his face. "Let's give him hell." With a deep breath, Bracken pushed the shuttle's engines to their limits, hurtling toward the alien installation like a missile. The shields shimmered ahead, a barrier between them and whatever salvation or destruction lay beyond. "Hold on," Bracken warned, bracing himself for impact. The collision was like being hit by a freight train. The shuttle shuddered, alarms screaming as they breached the shields, metal groaning in protest. But they made it through, hurtling into the heart of the installation with all the grace of a brick thrown through a window. "Now or never," Bracken barked, unstrapping himself from his seat and grabbing the equipment they'd need. The three of them disembarked into the alien structure, weapons drawn and nerves steeled. It was eerily silent, the only sound their own breathing and the distant hum of machinery. "Let's make this quick," Hylas said, leading the way with the assurance of someone who knew exactly what they were doing. Bracken and Venter followed, eyes scanning for threats as they moved deeper into the installation. The architecture was bizarre, all angles and glowing surfaces, like the fever dream of a deranged architect. "Looks like the control room's up ahead," Hylas said, pointing to a door that looked no different from any other except for the glowing panel beside it. "Here's hoping we can actually read alien tech," Bracken muttered, feeling distinctly out of his depth. Venter approached the panel, studying it with interest. "I've got a theory," he said, fingers hovering over the controls. "Care to share?" Bracken asked, trying not to sound too skeptical. Not particularly, Venter replied, pressing a series of buttons with the confidence of a man who'd never seen a bad plan he didn't like. The door slid open with a hiss, revealing a room filled with consoles and screens, all displaying incomprehensible data. "Looks like we've found the brain," Hylas said, moving to the nearest console and beginning to work his own brand of magic. Bracken kept watch, heart pounding in his chest as the seconds ticked by. If they were going to succeed, it had to be now, before the aliens realized what was happening and decided to swat them like flies. "Almost there," Hylas said, fingers flying over the alien interface with startling ease. "Make it quick," Bracken urged, every instinct screaming that time was running out. Venter stood by, weapon ready, his eyes scanning for any sign of trouble. "You know," he said conversationally, "if we survive this, drinks are on me." "You're damn right they are," Bracken replied, a grin tugging at his lips despite the tension. Finally, Hylas stepped back from the console, his expression triumphant. "Got it. Systems disrupted. That should throw a wrench in their plans." "Then let's get the hell out of here," Bracken said, already moving toward the exit. The three of them made their way back to the shuttle, adrenaline singing in their veins. Behind them, the alien installation was in chaos, lights flickering and systems going haywire as their sabotage took effect. "Let's hope this gives them something to think about," Venter said, strapping in as Bracken prepped the shuttle for departure. "More than they planned for, at least," Bracken replied, firing up the engines with a roar. As they punched back through the shields and away from the installation, the realization hit Bracken like a freight train. They'd done it. They'd actually pulled off the impossible. "To living another day," he said, raising an imaginary toast to his companions. "And to whatever comes next," Hylas added, his expression a mixture of relief and caution. The shuttle soared away from the installation, leaving behind a trail of disruption and a glimmer of hope. It wasn't over, not by a long shot, but for now they'd won. And in the vast, unforgiving void of space, that was a victory worth celebrating. Back on the station, the mood was about as cheerful as a funeral. Morale had dropped faster than a lead balloon, and Bracken couldn't blame anyone for feeling like the cosmic rug had been pulled out from under them. The only silver lining was that the station hadn't yet exploded or been turned into an alien plaything, minor victories in the grand scheme of impending doom. Bracken stood in the control room, staring at the console as if it might suddenly decide to behave like a piece of reliable technology. The damn thing flickered more than a disco ball in a blackout, and the constant stream of error messages made it clear that everything was circling the drain. "Earth still ignoring us?" Venter asked, leaning against the wall with the casual posture of a man who'd accepted his fate. "Yeah," Bracken replied, running a hand through his hair, which felt more like a tangled mess than anything resembling a commander's hairstyle. "Seems they've taken the ignore it and it might go away approach. Probably busy with their own problems," Venter suggested with a shrug. "Like deciding which color to paint the new bureaucratic offices. Or figuring out how to tax us from light years away," Bracken added, earning a chuckle from Venter that was more bitter than amused. Across the room, Hylas was hunched over a terminal, his fingers flying over the keys with an intensity that suggested he might be trying to hack his way off the station. "Hylas, any luck with that loophole you mentioned?" Bracken called out, hoping against hope that the man had found something useful in the bureaucratic mess. Hylas glanced up, his expression unreadable but somehow managing to convey the universe's biggest eye roll. "Let's just say I've found a glimmer in the muck," he replied, his voice as dry as the Sahara. "Apparently, in the unlikely event of unauthorized extraterrestrial interference, the station commander has the authority to initiate a Protocol F-22. Sounds fancy," Venter remarked. "What's Protocol F-22? Launching fireworks and hoping the aliens have a soft spot for human pyrotechnics." "Close," Hylas replied, his lips twitching in what might have been a smile if you squinted hard enough. "It's more like a bureaucratic nuke, Override standard procedure bypasses usual chains of command. Direct line to the top dogs back on Earth if they decide to pick up the call. Bracken perked up at that, a spark of hope flickering in the grim darkness. And you think we can pull it off? Hylas nodded, though his expression was more caution than confidence. If we play our cards right, but it's a long shot. We might as well be throwing rocks at a battleship. It's still a shot, Bracken said, straightening up with newfound resolve. Better than waiting around for the aliens to decide we're a nice appetizer. Venter pushed off the wall, crossing his arms with a look that was half cynical, half intrigued. So, what's the plan, boss? Start the bureaucratic equivalent of a bar fight. Exactly, Bracken replied, feeling that familiar mixture of anxiety and determination that accompanied any half-baked plan. We're going to make a mess so big they can't ignore it. Sounds like my kind of party, Venter said, a wicked gleam in his eyes. All right, let's get to work, Bracken ordered, turning back to the console. Hylas, you're our key to making this happen. Show us what you've got. The three of them crowded around the terminal, Hylas working with the kind of focus that suggested he was either a genius or completely insane. Bracken wasn't sure which he'd prefer. Genius might get them out of this mess, but insanity might make the ride a little more interesting. As Hylas worked, Venter filled the silence with his usual blend of sarcasm and gallows humor. You know, if this actually works, we should get a medal, or at least a mention in some obscure footnote in the history of human space exploration. More likely we'll just get a bill for all the damage, Bracken replied, watching the screen intently as Hylas navigated the labyrinth of bureaucratic protocols. Wouldn't be the first time, Venter said with a smirk, leaning back and watching the lights flicker above them. Let's just hope they don't charge us for emotional distress. The minutes ticked by, each one feeling like an eternity as they waited for the results. Bracken's heart pounded in his chest, a constant reminder of just how much was riding on this gamble. They were standing on the precipice, staring into the abyss, and all they could do was hope they didn't fall. Finally, Hylas let out a breath and leaned back, his work complete. Protocol F-22 initiated, he announced, though there was no fanfare, no confetti to mark the occasion. Just a series of beeps and a notification that flickered on the console screen. And now we wait, Bracken said, the words tasting as bitter as they sounded. Waiting was the last thing he wanted to do, but sometimes it was the only option left. Venter let out a low whistle, shaking his head in disbelief. Who would have thought? All it took was a bit of creative accounting to get the bigwigs' attention. Assuming they actually bother to answer, Hylas pointed out, ever the voice of reason. And if they don't, we're still right where we started. Yeah, but now we've got the satisfaction of knowing we tried everything short of dancing on the station's hull in a tutu, Bracken replied, a ghost of a smile tugging at his lips. And if nothing else, we went down swinging. Isn't that the only way to go down? Venter joked, though there was a somber edge to his voice that belied the humor. As they waited in tense silence, the station continued its slow march toward oblivion, each creak and groan a reminder of how precarious their situation was. They were adrift in a sea of uncertainty, clinging to the hope that someone somewhere would throw them a lifeline. It was Venter who finally broke the silence, his voice soft but steady. You know, I never thought this was how I'd go out. Always figured it would be something more mundane, like stepping on a loose grav board or choking on a protein bar. Bracken chuckled, though the sound was more hollow than he'd intended. Funny, I always imagined it would be some grand, heroic sacrifice, but this is just insignificant. Hylas looked up from his screen, a rare glint of amusement in his eyes. Didn't anyone tell you? Insignificance is the hallmark of true heroism. Well, if that's the case, we're bloody legends, Venter said with a dry laugh. Heroes of the unremarkable, champions of the mundane. Their laughter filled the control room, a brittle, fragile thing that was both comforting and unnerving. It was the laughter of people who had nothing left to lose, who were staring down the barrel of fate and daring it to pull the trigger. As the minutes stretched into an eternity, Bracken found himself reflecting on the absurdity of it all. Here they were, a ragtag band of misfits on a crumbling station, trying to outsmart both aliens and bureaucracy with little more than stubbornness and a knack for finding loopholes. It was like something out of a bad holo novel, and yet it was their reality. Finally, the console beeped, a sharp, insistent sound that cut through the oppressive silence. Bracken leaned forward, eyes wide with a mixture of hope and dread as he read the message that had appeared on the screen. "Response from Earth," he announced, his voice barely above a whisper. "They're sending a team to investigate." A collective sigh of relief swept through the room, the tension dissipating like smoke in the wind. It wasn't a guaranteed victory, not by a long shot, but it was a chance to turn the tides, to fight back against the encroaching darkness. "Looks like our little stunt paid off," Venter said, his grin wide and genuine for the first time in what felt like forever. Bracken nodded, a sense of cautious optimism taking root in the pit of his stomach. "It's not over yet, but it's a start." Hylas leaned back in his chair, the weight of the past few hours falling away in a rush of relief. "Let's just hope they're not too late." As they sat there, absorbing the news, Bracken found himself feeling something he hadn't allowed himself to indulge in for a long time: hope. It was a fragile, tenuous thing, but it was enough to keep them going, to give them the strength to face whatever came next. "To unlikely victories," Bracken said, raising an imaginary toast to his companions. "And to making the impossible possible," Venter added, his voice filled with a sense of wonder and determination. Hylas nodded, his expression as inscrutable as ever but with a hint of warmth beneath the surface. "And to us for daring to try." As they sat in the glow of the console's flickering light, the reality of their situation slowly sank in. They were still adrift in the vast, uncaring void, still facing insurmountable odds. But they had each other, and they had hope. And in the unforgiving darkness of space, that was something worth fighting for. Venter was the first to break the silence after Bracken's announcement. "So Earth's sending a team, huh? Great, we'll all be skeletons by the time they get here, or worse, politicians." Bracken shot him a withering look but couldn't suppress a smirk. The absurdity of their situation was almost comforting. "Well, better late than never, right? Maybe they'll bring us some decent coffee." Hylas arched an eyebrow, his hands never leaving the terminal keys. "You're assuming they even remember how to make decent coffee on Earth. Last I heard, they were still trying to figure out what cafeteria food was made from." "Soylent Green," Venter suggested, earning a collective groan. "Back to business," Bracken interjected. "We've got a response, but that doesn't mean we're out of the woods. We've stirred the bureaucratic pot, now we need to keep it simmering." "Right," Hylas agreed, focusing on the console. "Now that we've got their attention, we have to maintain it. Puck, how are those technical issues looking?" Puck emerged from the shadows, a smudge of grease on his forehead and a screwdriver in hand. "You mean the electrical storms, failing sensors, and reactor hiccups?" "Oh, peachy. Like a summer vacation on Mercury. I'm doing what I can, but the tech is as reliable as a politician's promise." "Perfect," Venter said, clapping Puck on the shoulder. "We wouldn't want things to be too easy." Bracken glanced at the console, the flickering lights a constant reminder of their precarious situation. "All right, Hylas, what's our next move?" Hylas didn't miss a beat. "We need to leverage every bit of that protocol F-22, play it like a chess game. We don't just need Earth to pay attention, we need them to act, and fast." "So, we're poking the bear with a really short stick," Venter summarized. "Exactly," Hylas replied. "Time for a good old-fashioned digital paper trail. We document everything, make it impossible for them to ignore us. Every glitch, every anomaly, every sneeze." Bracken nodded, feeling a renewed sense of purpose. "All right, team, let's make it happen. Venter, you handle the documentation. Make it so thorough even a blind man could see the problem." "Got it, boss. I'll make it read like a best-selling thriller." "Complete with plot holes," Puck chimed in. Venter grinned. "Only the best kind. Hylas, keep digging for any other loopholes we can exploit," Bracken continued. We need every advantage we can get. Hylas gave a curt nod, his focus never wavering. Already on it. Bracken turned to Puck next. And you keep the station running. I don't care if you have to use duct tape and prayers, just keep it from falling apart. Can do, Puck said, spinning the screwdriver like a gunslinger with a revolver. Duct tape and prayers, the foundation of modern technology. With their roles set, the team dispersed, each member diving into their tasks with a determination born not only of necessity, but of a stubborn refusal to go quietly into the night. Venter set up a makeshift office in the corner of the control room, surrounded by clouds of digital paperwork that would have made even the most diligent accountant break into a cold sweat. He typed furiously, compiling reports that detailed every hiccup and anomaly the station had experienced since they'd first detected the unauthorized terraforming activity. "So what's your title for this masterpiece?" Hylas asked, casting a sideways glance at Venter's screen. Venter paused, a smirk playing at his lips. "How about 50 Shades of Bureaucracy?" Bracken snorted. "Sounds like a thriller for masochists." "Isn't that all bureaucracy is?" Venter shot back, fingers dancing over the keys once more. Meanwhile, Puck was neck-deep in wires and circuits, battling the station's failing systems with a tenacity that bordered on heroic, or insane, depending on how you looked at it. Bracken moved over to him, stepping carefully over a tangle of cables. "How's it going?" "About as well as you'd expect," Puck replied, not looking up. "I've rerouted power from the lower decks to keep the main systems online. But it's a temporary fix. If the reactor decides to throw another tantrum, we're screwed." "So basically the usual." Puck nodded, a grim smile tugging at his lips. "Pretty much. You know, for a state-of-the-art space station, this place sure does run on hope and nostalgia." Bracken chuckled, despite the situation. "Yeah, well, let's hope that holds us long enough." As the hours passed, a tenuous sort of harmony settled over the control room. Each member of the team moved with purpose, the weight of their situation driving them forward even as the odds loomed impossibly large. They were a ragtag bunch, held together by spit, grit, and sheer bloody-mindedness. But they were all they had. Hylas was the first to break the silence, his voice cutting through the controlled chaos. "Found another loophole. Apparently, there's an old Earth directive that mandates immediate support for any station reporting unauthorized extraterrestrial military presence. Pretend to be under siege," Venter suggested, only half joking. "Or just embellish the truth," Hylas replied, a rare grin appearing on his face. "If they think we're about to be raided by little green men, they might actually send help." Bracken's eyes lit up. "That could work. Venter, include that in your report. Make it sound as dire as possible." Venter saluted with a flourish. "Consider it done, Captain." The minutes ticked by in a blur of activity, each second precious, each action deliberate. The station groaned and creaked around them, a metallic symphony of impending doom that only served to underscore the urgency of their task. Finally, with a flourish, Venter hit send on his last report. "Done and dusted. If that doesn't get their attention, nothing will." "Good," Bracken said, feeling a sense of cautious optimism creeping in. "Now we wait." "Again," Venter added, rolling his eyes. "Waiting's half the job in space," Hylas observed dryly. "The other half is the paperwork." The team settled into an uneasy silence, their nerves stretched tight as they waited for Earth to respond. It was a strange sort of limbo, a moment suspended in time where anything seemed possible, and yet nothing seemed likely. Bracken found himself reflecting on the sheer ridiculousness of it all. They weren't soldiers or politicians. They were engineers, technicians, and bureaucrats. Yet here they were, fighting for their lives against odds so astronomical they might as well have been written in the stars themselves. "Think they'll actually do something this time?" Puck asked, breaking the silence with a question that lingered in the air like smoke. Bracken shrugged, the movement more resigned than hopeful. "Who knows? But at least we can say we tried." "Isn't that what they always say?" Venter quipped, though his voice lacked its usual bite. "Yeah, well, sometimes it's all you've got," Bracken replied, his gaze fixed on the flickering console. Just then the console beeped again, its insistent chirp slicing through the tension like a knife. Bracken leaned in, his heart pounding as he read the message. Earth's acknowledged receipt of our reports, he announced, eyes scanning the screen. They're reviewing our case. Wonderful, Venter said, the sarcasm thick enough to cut. They're going to review us to death. Well, it's better than being ignored, Hylas pointed out, though his tone suggested he wasn't entirely convinced. Bracken nodded, though a knot of anxiety twisted in his gut. We can only do so much from our end. Now we just have to hope it's enough. The team settled back into their work, the adrenaline giving way to exhaustion. They'd done everything they could, and now it was up to the bureaucratic gods to decide their fate. You know, Venter mused, idly spinning his chair, if we survive this, we should write a book. The Idiot's Guide to Surviving Space Bureaucracy, and subtitle it, or How Not to Die in the Cold Vacuum of Space, Hylas suggested, his lips quirking in a rare smile. Think it'd sell? Puck asked, his voice laced with dry humor. If it doesn't, we can always use the copies as firewood, Venter replied with a wink. Their laughter was a tenuous thing, fragile and fleeting, but it was enough to pierce the oppressive gloom that hung over the station. It was a reminder that they were still alive, still fighting, despite the odds stacked against them. As the Iors dragged on, Bracken found himself caught between hope and despair, each moment a delicate balance between the two. He knew better than to count on a miracle, but he couldn't help but wish for one all the same. Are we really going to make it out of this? Puck asked quietly, voicing the question that had been haunting them all. Bracken didn't have an answer, but he nodded all the same. We have to, because we're too stubborn to give up, Venter suggested with a wry smile. Exactly, Bracken agreed, a determined glint in his eyes. If nothing else, we won't go down without a fight. And so they waited, the station creaking and groaning around them, a symphony of impending chaos that underscored their precarious existence. They were alone, adrift in a universe that seemed indifferent to their plight, but they had each other and they had hope. In the darkness of space, that was something worth clinging to, even if it was all they had. All right, let's see what these earthbound desk jockeys have sent us this time, Bracken said, tapping the console like it owed him money. The screen flickered more than a bad disco, a constant reminder that space life was less Star Trek and more bureaucratic hell. Anything promising? Venter asked, spinning his chair lazily. He acted like he had all the time in the world, which, given their situation, was hilariously optimistic. Bracken squinted at the screen. They've approved our request to initiate Protocol F-22. Basically, they're letting us play with the emergency toy box. Finally, some bureaucratic creativity, Venter quipped. I was worried they'd forgotten how to rubber stamp things. Only took what? 5-6 existential threats, Hylas mused, typing furiously at his terminal. If they'd moved any slower, they'd be going backwards. At least now we can deploy countermeasures, Bracken noted. Assuming our brilliant engineer here can get them working. Puck, who was tangled in wires like a kitten in a yarn disaster, looked up with a smirk. Hey, if it ain't broke, I probably haven't looked at it yet. Great, so our survival is in the hands of a man whose mantra is let's see what happens, Venter said. It's a solid philosophy, Puck shot back, unless you actually want things to work. Focus, team, Bracken said, trying to sound commanding while fighting the urge to laugh at the absurdity of it all. We need to follow through with this plan, right? So we're actually deploying the countermeasures this time, Venter asked with mock surprise. And here I was thinking we were going to just dance around the problem like usual. Fancy footwork's always an option, Hylas said dryly. But I doubt the aliens will be impressed. Bracken sighed, rubbing his temples. All right, sarcasm aside, let's get serious. Serious. Us, Puck said, raising an eyebrow. Isn't that against station policy? Only if it involves actual work, Venter added, grinning. Luckily, we outsourced that to the aliens. All right, so here's the plan, Bracken interrupted, waving a finger for attention like a teacher with the world's worst class. We've got the go-ahead to engage the countermeasures, but it's up to us to make it convincing. We're talking smoke and mirrors, folks. We're in space, Bracken. Oxygen's a premium, so maybe skip the smoke, Hylas pointed out, not looking up from his terminal antics. Fine, so more mirrors then, Bracken conceded. We need to make it look like we're not just a bunch of sitting ducks here, more like sitting pigeons, Puck muttered. At least they can fly away. Hylas, what's your status on the terminal? Bracken asked, trying to steer the conversation back to the task at hand. Working on the digital sleight of hand now, Hylas replied. If they do decide to look, it'll seem like we're a lot more formidable than we actually are. So, we're bluffing? Venter asked. Bracken nodded. More like we're raising the stakes. Bluffing, raising. It's all a card game until someone flips the table, Puck said. Good thing we're the ones dealing then, Bracken replied with a half-smile. Let's rig this game. Puck paused his makeshift engineering efforts to stare at one of the station's flickering lights. You know, I could swear that light is trying to communicate with us. Probably just Morse coding a scream for help, Venter quipped. I feel its pain. Focus, people, Bracken said, though he was fighting to keep a straight face. We've got a universe to save, or at least our sorry butts, Venter added, not missing a beat. Hylas tapped away at his terminal, his fingers moving like they had their own minds. All right, I've reinforced our comms channels to make sure the countermeasures signals are strong. If any aliens are snooping, they'll think we're about to unleash hell. Pre-cooked hell, though, right? Puck asked. Because the station's microwave doesn't seem to want to cooperate either. Bracken ignored him. Venter, you're in charge of initiating the countermeasures when the time comes. Ah, the glory of pressing the big red button, Venter said with exaggerated enthusiasm. Do I get a medal if I don't screw it up? You get to keep breathing, Bracken replied dryly. Good enough for me. Venter stretched, cracking his knuckles. Let's hope these aliens are as susceptible to bureaucracy as we are. If they are anything like us, they're already drowning in their own paperwork, Hylas said. We just need to light the match. Metaphorically, Bracken added quickly, eyeing Puck warily. Oh, you take all the fun out of it, Puck said, continuing to wrestle with the station's internal wiring. They worked in a familiar chaos, a symphony of clattering keys and clinking tools. It was a rhythm born out of necessity, each of them moving with a purpose that said they'd done this 1,000 times before, perhaps because they had in one way or another. Minutes blurred into hours, the teams focused sharp as they prepared their counterstrike. It was a long shot, a Hail Mary in the vastness of space, but it was all they had. At last the preparations were complete. Bracken looked around the control room at his team of misfits and geniuses at the improbability of it all. All right, people, he said, feeling a strange mix of tension and relief. Time to see if our hard work pays off, or if the universe decides to bend us over a barrel, Venter said cheerfully. Ever the optimist, Hylas noted, not unkindly. Bracken checked the console, fingers dancing over controls like a pianist on their last performance. Venter, initiate countermeasures. Venter gave a mock salute. With pleasure. He pressed a button with a flourish, and the station shuddered to life around them. The lights flickered, alarms blared, and somewhere, a panel burst open with a shower of sparks. Impressive start, Puck commented, shielding his eyes from the electrical firework display. Let's hope that's the only explosion we get. Well, it's a start, Bracken said, trying to sound more confident than he felt. Hylas, the countermeasures are deploying, Hylas confirmed, his terminal a flurry of activity. If the aliens are watching, they'll think we've just upped the ante. And if they are not, Venter asked. Then we're just putting on one hell of a show for ourselves, Hylas replied with a shrug. Bracken crossed his arms, watching the console's erratic glow. Come on, you bureaucratic bastards, he muttered under his breath. Take the bait. Their plan was simple in its complexity. Make the station appear more formidable than it was, trick the aliens into thinking twice about their plans. They were counting on the aliens being just as tangled in politics and caution as any earth-bound organization. And now we wait, Puck said, leaning back against the wall with a sigh. The worst part. Why is it always waiting? Venter asked, throwing his hands up. You'd think in space we'd be moving faster. Time's relative, especially when you're stuck in a tin can orbiting a gas giant, Hylas said, running a hand through his disheveled hair. But hey, at least we outdid ourselves in the last act. Bracken watched as the countermeasure indicators blinked on the screen, a dance of lights that promised either salvation or spectacular failure. He felt the weight of it all, the pressure of leadership, the absurdity of their situation. What happens if it doesn't work? Venter asked, his voice softer than usual. Bracken took a moment before answering. Then we improvise like we always do. Not like we have anything else to lose, right? Puck added, feigning a cheerfulness that didn't quite reach his eyes. Just another day on the job, Hylas said with a rueful smile. The station creaked ominously, a reminder of the fragile nature of their existence. They were out there in the cold void of space, facing odds that would make anyone else turn tail and run. But they were too stubborn, too determined, and perhaps just crazy enough to believe they could pull it off. Think the aliens are just as nervous? Venter asked, breaking the silence. Probably second-guessing their career choices, Puck said with a grin. Probably asking themselves why they didn't just become space accountants. Here's hoping, Bracken said, eyes fixed on the console. Here's hoping. As the minutes turned to hours, the team settled into a restless sort of waiting, each of them lost in their own thoughts. They'd done everything they could. Now it was up to fate or the universe or whoever was listening to decide their outcome. So what's next on the agenda? Venter asked, finally breaking the silence. More waiting, Bracken confirmed, hating the words even as he said them. Can't wait, Puck said dryly. Bracken leaned back in his chair, feeling the weight of fatigue settle in. If this works, I'm taking a long vacation. Think they'll let us? Hylas asked, not bothering to hide his skepticism. They'll have to, Bracken replied, a hint of defiance in his voice. Because if we survive this, I'm done with bureaucracy for a while. Until the next crisis, Venter reminded him. Yeah, but I'll milk this one for all it's worth first, Bracken said, a grim smile tugging at his lips. The console beeped suddenly, a sound that cut through the tension like a knife. Bracken sat up, eyes widening as he read the incoming message. Earth's responding, he announced, voice tight with anticipation. They're sending reinforcements. See, Venter said with a grin. All it took was a little creative paperwork. Guess they finally realized we're not just some abandoned outpost, Puck said, sounding almost impressed. Hylas let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Looks like our bluff worked. Bracken took a moment to process the news, relief mingling with disbelief. They'd done it. Against all odds, they'd managed to sway the bureaucratic juggernaut that was Earth. We did it, he said, the words more an affirmation than anything. So, drinks on you when we get back, Venter suggested, a twinkle in his eye. Only if we make it back, Bracken replied, though the weight of despair had lifted just a little. With renewed hope and a shared sense of accomplishment, the team settled in to watch the console, waiting for the reinforcements that would finally tip the scales in their favor. In the silence of space, surrounded by the vastness of the unknown, they clung to the one thing that had kept them going all along, their stubborn, unyielding humanity. And if the universe wasn't ready for them, well, that was its problem. The station hummed with a new, strangely optimistic energy. It was as if it had been biding its time, waiting for some cosmic joke to finally land. With the alien threat neutralized, or at least thoroughly confused by Earth's belated bureaucratic reinforcements, life aboard the station settled into its usual rhythm, organized chaos with a side of despair. Bracken stood in the control room, staring at the console as it glowed with a rare sense of purpose. It was still a finicky piece of technology, more temperamental than an out-of-tune violin, but today it felt like an old friend who decided to finally pull its weight. He turned to Hylas, who was still typing away at his terminal. Well, looks like we live to fight another day. Hylas didn't even look up. Assuming fighting involves more waiting and less actual movement. Don't start, Bracken said with a sigh, though the corners of his mouth twitched upward. "You know how much I love our existential chats." Hylas finally glanced up, a sardonic smile playing on his lips. "So, we managed to throw a wrench into the alien machinery. What's next?" "Start a book club." "Yeah, How to Survive Bureaucracy in Space would make a bestseller," Bracken quipped. Chapter 1, Send Distress Signals. Chapter 2, Wait. Chapter 3, Complain until someone does something, Hylas added. "It's a winning formula." Across the room, Puck was tinkering with some wires, looking as if Christmas had come early. "I'd say we're an odds-defying miracle, but I'm pretty sure we're just stubborn idiots." "Speak for yourself," Venter chimed in, cracking his knuckles. "I prefer tenacious bastards, has a nicer ring to it." Bracken shook his head, fondness creeping into his voice despite the situation. "Call it what you will, but we're still here. And that's what counts, right?" Puck said, wiping his greasy hands on his coveralls. "Even if I might have to rewire this entire station by the time we're done." "Consider it job security," Venter said with a shrug. "And if we survive, maybe they'll teach us how to make coffee that doesn't taste like engine oil." "Dream big, Venter," Hylas said, tapping his terminal with one hand while running the other through his hair. "Maybe one day we'll even get a raise." "Raise," Venter laughed, a sound that echoed off the metal walls. "In this economy," Bracken took a deep breath, the kind of breath that says, "I can't believe this is my life, but here we are." "All right, let's not get too carried away. Remember, we still have a station to run. And a universe to save," Venter added, his grin returning. "Or at least a small part of it." The team continued their tasks, the air heavy with a mixture of relief and tension. The threat was gone for now, but the weight of survival lingered. They'd managed to stave off disaster, but at what cost? The station was a patchwork of quick fixes and desperate measures, a testament to human ingenuity and its limits. "Hey, Bracken," Venter said, leaning over the console. "You ever think about what we'd be doing if Earth actually did their job right?" "Probably sitting on a beach somewhere, sipping cocktails," Bracken replied, his tone light. "But then who'd protect the universe from paperwork?" "That's a sacrifice I'm willing to make," Venter said, a hint of wistfulness in his voice. Puck chuckled, his hands deftly working on a circuit board. "Yeah, but then we'd miss out on all the fun of impending doom." "Can't argue with that," Bracken said, though his eyes were on the console where the lights still flickered in a haphazard dance. "This is what we signed up for after all." "Did we, though?" Hylas asked, his tone thoughtful. "Or did we just not read the fine print?" "Doesn't matter," Puck said, connecting the last of the wires with a flourish. "We're here and we're alive." "That's gotta count for something." Bracken nodded slowly. "Yeah, it does." The room was silent for a moment, the kind of silence that follows a storm. They'd done the impossible, stared down the unknown, and come out the other side. It was a victory, albeit a small one, in a universe that seemed hell-bent on testing their resolve. "So, are we heroes now?" Venter asked, breaking the silence with his usual flair. Bracken snorted, shaking his head. "Hardly, just a bunch of misfits who got lucky." "Luck's just skill in disguise," Puck said, leaning back with a satisfied grin. "Or a cruel joke," Hylas added, though there was no malice in his words. "Either way," Bracken said, rubbing the back of his neck, "we've got work to do." "Always," Venter said, standing up and stretching. "But at least we know we can handle it." Bracken watched his team, a strange sense of pride welling up inside him. They were a ragtag bunch of survivors, flawed and imperfect, but they were his. And for all their faults, they'd proven themselves time and time again. "All right," he said, clapping his hands together. "Let's get back to it." The team dispersed, each returning to their respective tasks with renewed vigor. It wasn't over, not by a long shot, but they'd bought themselves time. And in space, time was a precious commodity. As Bracken settled back into his chair, his eyes drifted to the console where a new message blinked into view. It was from Earth, a formal acknowledgement of their efforts and a promise of further support. Bureaucratic nonsense, wrapped in a pretty bow. He couldn't help but smirk. "Guess they are finally paying attention." Venter peered over his shoulder, reading the message with a critical eye. "Think they'll actually follow through this time?" Wouldn't bet on it, Bracken replied, though there was a glint of hope in his eyes. But maybe they'll surprise us. You sound optimistic, Hylas said, arching an eyebrow. Just tired, Bracken admitted, rubbing his eyes. But hey, if we can pull this off, anything's possible. That's the spirit, Puck said, rejoining the group with a triumphant look. And if not, we'll just rig the game again. Bracken chuckled, feeling lighter than he had in weeks. Sounds like a plan. With the station buzzing around them, the team settled into the familiar routine, their determination undaunted. They were survivors through and through, and come what may, they'd face it together. So, Venter said, breaking the comfortable silence, who's up for a game of cards? Bracken grinned, the weight of the universe momentarily forgotten. Deal me in. Asterisk. Time marched on as it always did, indifferent to the dramas of human life. The station slowly stabilized, systems humming with new life after the impromptu repairs. It was a fragile piece, one held together by duct tape and sheer determination. Bracken stood by the window, staring out at the swirling mass of Jupiter below. It was a constant reminder of their place in the universe, small and insignificant, yet undeniably resilient. Staring at giant gas balls again, Hylas asked, joining him with a cup of something that vaguely resembled coffee. Reminds me of home, Bracken said with a wry smile. All bluster and no substance. Hylas took a sip of his drink, grimacing at the taste. Well, at least you don't have to deal with rush hour traffic. True, Bracken conceded. Just endless bureaucracy and alien invasions. Swings and roundabouts, Hylas said, clinking his cup against Bracken's. Bracken turned to face his friend, a rare moment of sincerity in his eyes. You ever think about leaving all this behind, going back to Earth, living a normal life? Hylas shrugged, his gaze distant. What's normal anymore? Good point, Bracken said, turning back to the view. But still, sometimes I wonder if it's worth it. It is, Hylas said, his voice firm. As long as we're out here, we're making a difference. Even if no one notices, especially then, Hylas said with a small smile. We're like the unsung heroes of space, unappreciated, overworked, underpaid. Sounds about right, Bracken said, shaking his head. But you know what? I'd do it all again. Same here, Hylas said, his expression softening. We're too stubborn to quit. Bracken chuckled, the sound mingling with the soft hum of the station. They were an odd pair, united by circumstance and bonded by shared experience. It wasn't the life they'd imagined, but it was theirs, and they'd fight for it with everything they had. All right, Bracken said, pushing off the window ledge. Back to work. Hylas nodded, finishing his drink with a grimace. Can't let the universe run itself, can we? Not without us, Bracken said, clapping him on the shoulder. Let's keep this heap of metal flying. They returned to the control room where Venter and Puck were engaged in a heated debate over some technicality or another. It was comforting in a way to see that some things never changed. We're back, Bracken announced, taking his seat with a thud. Miss anything exciting? Venter asked, sparing them a glance. Just deep philosophical musings, Hylas said, sliding into his own chair. Glad to see you're keeping busy, Puck said, rolling his eyes. Bracken smirked, feeling a renewed sense of purpose. All right, let's get to it. We've got a station to run and a universe to defy. And plenty of red tape to cut through, Venter added with a jaunty salute. Wouldn't have it any other way, Bracken said, the weight of leadership settling comfortably on his shoulders. They worked in tandem, each movement precise and familiar. It was a dance they'd perfected over countless crises, a testament to their resilience and adaptability. They were survivors, not by choice but by necessity, and come what may, they'd continue to face the unknown with grit and humor. The universe might be vast and uncaring, but they were determined to carve out a place for themselves among the stars. And if that meant dealing with bureaucracy, alien threats, and dodgy coffee, so be it. After all, they were only human.